apologies for absence. Any declarations of interest anybody might have that are not listed in it. I have Nina as a as an absent for very good reasons, is unable to be with us today. Do we have any others? I can't see Jim at the moment. And Manisa's online. Okay. Minutes of the last meeting. Are people happy that that's an accurate record of the last meeting? Good, thank you. Very clear minutes as ever. So matters arising. First of all, Sally, there's a matter arising actually in the minutes around the strategy.
Yes, so we've started having discussions with chairs of committees, and we're looking to develop a bit more of a proposal, which we thought we could bring back to the April Board Away Day to discuss with colleagues about reporting up through the committees.
Thank you. And then there are two matters arising, one of which is complete. The other one, which I think we were hoping would be complete, which is the response to the special review of the sad events that happen in Nottinghamshire, but that which Abby you've got, but things have. The centre has taken time to produce various reports that we need to respond to, I think is the answer, isn't it?
Yes, and then the NHS review came out on the 5th of February.
Yeah.
And there are 13 recommendations, 2 are national, 11 for the trust in question, but other trusts have been asked to look at their services in the context of those 11. So we're supposed to bring it back to the board before the end of June. So we've got internal meetings to do that, if he has mentioned it in his report. So we are.
Just the last point that Abby made, that it's mentioned in my report, and the timeline we're working to is to come back in the May board meeting to share an update of what we're doing here in Oxleas with the board.
Thank you. We look forward to that. Okay, we'll now move on to. Sorry, Joe, I do apologise.
Yeah, just to say on the one that's marked complete, that hasn't come back to the Business and Infrastructure Committee yet. So I think there's various internal meetings, but Rachel, I think I'm right, aren't I? That hasn't come back. The emergency planning and business continuity piece. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that would just close the loop.
Okay, yes. So
given the action was for the BIC to look at it, we haven't.
Thank you. So the executive have done their bit, but we're waiting for it has yet to reach the BIC. Okay, so perhaps we could keep that up as a live action until it's closed. I think that's right. Thank you. Okay, now service user and carer involvement focus. Neil, could you please introduce this item? Thank you.
Very happy to. Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to introduce Melina Sanusi, who's actually, I think you know a number of people here. Melina has helped us with a number of projects, but the project that we're presenting today is around cultural sensitivity. So if you want to think about where this sits in the organisation, this is a piece of work I think Ian is sort of holding a lot of it around. It's really clear that unless we understand cultural factors, then some people will get a service, some people may not, and that has huge implications. So in this work, we've obviously been working with staff, but it's been really important to get the service user perspective on this, about how this works. So this is about opening the door, trying to make everything more effective. Melina has been involved in some of the culture curiosity work, and we want to show one of the films. And on the 14th of February, there was a webinar where the film was shown and there's a discussion. So I've asked Melina to come along. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great. Say something about what you do. I'll play the film. And then we take questions about how the webinar went and your experience.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Most of you probably already know that I'm a member of Involve. Outside of Involve, I'm a graphic designer, and I also have my own business selling handmade and personalized jewelry. At Involve, I'm a member of the Shadow Committee in Common and also Equity Reference Group. I've also been involved with some focus groups and also roundtable discussions. I've also been involved with the Cultural Curiosity Project. Like Neil said, we did some webinar where the video that we created with the equity group was shown to the staff for learning and also discussions. I've also recently been involved with Salomons Institute, where I'm a placement advisor to 2 trainee psychologists. Back to the Cultural Curiosity Project. I think it's great to have these kind of discussions, especially at Oxleas, where Andrew was asking whether people are being listened to. I think this is one of the proof that we are being listened to, and we constantly have these discussions about different subjects. And the thing with healthcare is that it's a very emotional subject, and it takes people a lot of time to process their thinking. And at Oxleas and with the involved group, we get peer support, and we have a period of time to be able to have our thoughts and through learning as well about the healthcare system, and having discussions as self-reflections with our peers, we are able to have more constructive criticisms, or not criticisms, but more feedback, constructive feedback that are hopefully a better solution than just having a data that are taken from surveys, where the data is quite important to have a general consensus. I think it then needs these further discussions with each other to know what the capacity is and how we can work together with the staff and the healthcare system to come up with solutions that are relevant to the public. So I'm going to go back to Neil now for the video.
How would you describe yourself and your background, and what do you consider to be your cultural identity?
I consider myself multicultural, having been born in Indonesia and spent some time in Singapore before living in the UK. I'm Chinese by ethnicity.
How has your cultural identity influenced you or shaped how you access and experience services?
I have used Oxleas Time to Talk in the past, and I had an excellent experience with the service. I felt cared for regardless of my background, and felt understood despite initial nervousness about communication barriers. Some of the challenges I face as an individual when using services include dealing with stigma in my community, where some people may have negative perspective or hesitance in modern health science and research, that sometimes ignore symptoms hoping it would go away on its own, or try to cure themselves in various ways that may not necessarily help. This can present difficulty in feeling supported to access medical resources, especially when dealing with mental health. This can also cause reluctance in getting help at early stages of symptoms, which is quite crucial for getting the best care or an increased chance of successful treatment. Being a person with a different culture can feel quite intimidating, with barriers in multiple aspects, but it can be as trivial as difficulties engaging in small talks. There is a sense of instinctive awareness of my surroundings. This requires me to change my mindset to feel more comfortable with my discomfort.
What would you say are some of the challenges you mentioned that your community faces?
I would say people not very willing to find help when needed. Like I mentioned, they would try to cure themselves as a first step instead of going to a professional.
If there's one thing that you could change about your experience or that of a loved one, what would you say it would be?
I would say perhaps there's a lack of awareness about improvement efforts in services. And I think people often have fear that they might not be treated well because of their culture or background. And I think services should share their journey more publicly, their successes and struggle in their efforts, in order for people, everyone to be able to relate and have a better understanding of the system. And hopefully by doing so, it could pave a path for the community for a back and forth discussion. And by having a better understanding of what the efforts are that are being made and what could be done more of to change this if the community has a better understanding of what's being done, they could give a first-hand experience of whether the direction being taken is well perceived.
If there's a message that you could give to your community, what would it be?
I think growth can start from spending more time for each other, showing compassion and patience amongst each other, eagerness for an open mind to expand our knowledge, as we are living in a world where our society is changing so rapidly. I encourage everyone, regardless of differences, to be vulnerable, to give a chance for staff to get to know their unique selves, to believe in the best of intentions unless proven otherwise. And let's help educate each other of our unique identity and life experiences. Let's aim to understand and in turn be understood. And I hope healthcare services will continue to reassure the public that they're in safe hands.
So, Melina, this was shown at a webinar and you had some experiences, and I'd love to just hear whether you feel you've been listened to all the effects of that webinar and how that worked for you. So over to you.
You want this microphone?
That looks more showbiz.
Yeah, so you can be a bit more sparkly.
The experience was great, and I felt quite privileged to be invited to the webinar, and also today to be presenting this. Although I was quite nervous, this feels really welcoming, and I feel quite welcome, and I'm quite comfortable here, and that says a lot about the trust. With the experience with the cultural curiosity, there were quite a lot of questions from the staff, and I think overall I feel listened to.
Okay, over to Chair.
Thank you, Marlene. Questions or comments? Abby, perhaps first.
Thank you very much, Melina. And you can see we don't bite, so you'll be fine. It was a great presentation. There was something you said there which I found interesting, that people should be open-minded and trust staff unless they've got reason not to. There's some communities that have reason not to, in terms of how they've been treated or assumptions that have been made about them based on their cultural background. How would you say we should approach those kind of communities? That's my first question. And the second question, you said about listening. How do we listen to communities rather than the service going to say, this is what we do? How do we flip it and ask, what do you want from us?
I think I grew up in a time where we were not encouraged to look up information online, and now we come to this era where we are encouraged to look up information online quite a lot, and I think that trust will need time to build, and I think with the help of service users being involved with projects, hopefully those people can be the voice for the community, and if they are able to understand the issues better and have a better understanding, hopefully they will be able to bring that knowledge back to their community, and that word of mouth is quite powerful. Sorry, did I answer everything? Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very powerful presentation. And if you don't want to answer the question I'm going to ask, just don't answer it. But I'm going to preface it by saying that I went to the counselling service at my university 40 years ago, and it took me an enormous amount of time to pluck up courage to go. I think probably about a year. And it was desperation that drove me there. And following that, I became a bit of a psychotherapy junkie and found it enormously helpful and supportive, in various points of my life. What I'm wondering, I know that you've used time to talk, and there was obviously a bit of a jump or leap, of faith to get in there. What helped you to do that?
For me, I went to the GP first, and it was similar to you. It was desperation, and I guess I'm when I have problems with myself, like I don't tend to let it just continue to be a problem. So I think I was quite self-initiated to find help when I was feeling desperate. Yeah, I think it maybe the GP was quite helpful as well, and they said you could self-refer, and that being understood kind of help, because I thought, yeah, they understand what's happening.
If I could just reflect that. So it sounds as though what was really helpful was having a GP who listened to you and expressed some understanding, but then also that you remained in control, that you were able to refer yourself was quite important to you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Jo.
Necessary for Melina. I think this work is really excellent, and I'm keen to look at the other videos as well. But I wondered what internally our next step is on this, and I'm thinking about whether with all the neighbourhood work going on, is there sort of an angle into that maybe? I'm looking at Ian for that.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, this obviously, and I think Neil and Melina have mentioned this fits into what we're terming BAFOS. So thinking about how we create, amongst other things, culturally sensitive services. I think I've said to the board before that I think we've had a number of false starts around this, partly because I think there's so much that we could do. It's finding an entry point. So we have, to coin one of Abby's phrases, we've kind of flipped our approach, partly because each of the services are already engaged in some interesting work. So what we've asked them to do, and we did workshop this earlier in the year, to come up with their kind of 3 priority issues, and then to think about how as an organisation, on a kind of cross-cutting basis, we support them to achieve those ambitions. So I think those priorities will shift over time, but that's the approach we're going to take, and the plan is to more formally report that through the quality committee than we have done to date, and up through the board. So I just thought it'd be useful to kind of show how the work that Melina and others have, and the insights that you're providing are kind of really shaping that. I mean, neighbourhood is all about thinking at a kind of fairly kind of microcosmic level about difference, and we know, I mean, there's good population health data which is being used to drive the kind of creation of these neighbourhoods. So I think it will squarely be part of that. I mean, I'll come to talk about neighbourhoods later. I'm really keen to build in flexibility into the design of it. And it is part of the fact that you know what works in one area won't work in another, and not rush to kind of concrete solutions around access. And I think part of that is having conversations with different communities about their history with us. I mean, there are some parts of Bexley, Bromley and Greenwich that are quite vocal about what they want, and that's what we need to harness. I mean, if you know, Thamesmead springs to mind as an area which they are a very energised and kind of vocal group. So I think that will really help. If we're serious, we will involve people in the shaping of the neighbourhoods, and this stuff will come out. Yeah.
So thank you, Melina. My comment, I mean, and it's probably a comment rather than a question as well, is the other community we need to think about, whether community is the right word, but are people of a different generation from many of us sitting around the table, that, you know, my children certainly have different assumptions and beliefs and understandings about the world and the way the world should be than I do, because they've been brought up in a different world than the one I was brought up in. And so I think that's something that perhaps we also need to think about as we do this work as well. It's intergenerational as well. Would be good to think about. Asma.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer the question that I've got, because you talked about you went and you got self-help. What's really interesting when we look at the data, and actually if I reflect on my own community and whereabouts it is, men are far less likely to come forward at the early stages than women, because women will tend to at least talk about it amongst friends before they then do the access. Has that been covered in any element of the involved group, or have you taken any of that back to your own community?
I think we had some data, but it was not specifically on this area. But it's definitely something that we could probably talk about in our groups.
I think it would be really interesting to be able to explore that as well as the generational element, because I think we actually do have evidence that that group are less likely to come forward at an earlier stage, while still obviously absolutely meeting the needs of our female service users.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point too. Yes, we can cut our communities in so many different ways, which is important for us to consider. Any final questions? No. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time and for your really thoughtful video and thoughtful answers to the questions. It's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. I won't clap because we'll just deafen the people on the screen. Okay, thank you. So now we move on, Iffy, to the Board Assurance Framework update, which is paper 4. I think it's paper 5 actually on the meeting.
Thank you, Chair. Hope you can all hear me. So board members, I'm sure, will recall firstly that twice every year we go through the Board Assurance Framework in some detail, and we did so only a few months ago. I was saying to Sue that I can't believe it's 6 months already. So it's that time again. What we hope we'll do today is have the board committee chairs and the exec lead take us through the risks on the BAF, perhaps pay more attention to the high or moderate risks, and also thinking ahead. Just by way of summary, you would have seen from the front sheet that there are 4 high risks, 2 moderate and 1 low, and there hasn't been a great deal of shift or change since we last reviewed. Can I invite the board committees to please take us through the risks in the order in which they appear in the pack, just to make it easier. Yeah, thank you. Is that for me to, yeah.
Joe, you could start.
Go, thank you.
Thanks. So business and infrastructure, I mean, not a whole load of changes. I don't think you'd expect that. So financial sustainability of the trust is still significant. Maybe if there was a higher rating than significant, it might be that. I don't know. We understand the context there, and I don't think there's an awful lot to say. Once I've introduced these risks, Azra, I'm sure we'll add comments. However, the good news is the in-year plan for both revenue and capital, we've now reduced to low. Similar pattern to what we've seen over the last couple of years, that as we get through the year and we become more confident that we will meet our target for the year, we reduce that risk. So with where are we, about 20 days to go, we're feeling relatively confident. Not quite sure what the final number is yet, but we're relatively confident we're going to hit whatever that is. The next one is interesting, the ICS capital regime. So this is how this came in a few years ago, that we are allocated a capital spend rather than something that we generate ourselves. And I think the team were thinking that we could reduce this risk a bit. Unfortunately, we've started those talks about what capital allocation might look like over the next year, and we've held it at moderate because of obvious restrictions, I guess, coming through, and how we manage within that envelope. We're not quite there yet in terms of what that will look like. We I guess, know the landing area. But the other thing we've seen in previous years is we've seen reductions to capital spend target because of other factors. For example, the ICS missing their financial target has reduced that capital spend. So definitely, I think, sort of on the slight worry list, that we know that we need a decent amount of capital to keep in our relatively good place in where we are on reactive maintenance, for example, and do what we need to do, and carry on with our digital work. What I would say is the team digital has been very good at securing bits of extra money. I mean, your success rate on that has been really good, so that's quite helpful. I think we've secured another 1.6 million this year, which is kind of out with the target because it's funded elsewhere, which is good. The next item is the Bexley Private Finance Initiative. I think Business and Infrastructure Committee are going to get an update on this either this month or next month. I think we understand the broad aspect of the journey now. We know probably what we want to do. The key thing we need now is to get all the surveys done. And that's slow progress, isn't it, to even get the agreement? Agreement's not signed yet, is it? No. Which is the standstill deed we talked about, I think, in December. That brings its own concerns because we need to get certain amount of work done in order to be able to give appropriate notice and things like that. So that's a bit of a squeeze point, but we haven't had a recent update. We'll get one soon. Cyber is significant. I think we are in a relatively good place. I think the team are on top of things, but we all know from everything that goes on outside that this is a risk where the risk factors are always on the increase because people come up with very creative ways of causing issues, and we have to be able to react to that. So it's a risk where the risk is increasing all the time. And as I said, whilst we're in a relatively good place, I think there's good focus across the ICS and the NHS in general on cyber, not least because of some of the incidents that have happened elsewhere. Again, it's not something that I can see us reducing from significant anytime soon. And then the final one for us is achieving carbon zero. That's high. Again, we've asked for a fuller update on this risk. The biggest issue here is to decarbonise costs a lot of money. It currently costs a lot of money. And there's that point where, we think it will cost less money in the future. And at what point do you flip to that? But I think what is going well at the moment is we are beginning to factor in our objectives around carbon into other projects. So, for example, we are doing quite a lot of work on a property at Goldie Lee, and whilst we are going with a more traditional boiler, all the pipe work and the radiators are being sized to accommodate heat pump in the future. So that's, I think, a really positive thing. Done an awful lot of work at Memorial as well. Things like replacing windows obviously really help as well. Azra, do you want to pick up anything I've said and got wrong?
So I think you've done a very thorough review of all of the risks that we've got here. I think the only two areas I'd just like to pick up on is on the revenue and capital. So this is the revenue and capital delivery in year. I do think that we will be able to hit those, but we're not going to land on the figure until month 12. So it's just being aware of that the figures may shift. It won't be any lower than the 1 million that we originally planned for, but it's whether or not how much of a stretch will be required. And on the capital regime, I received a paper yesterday that is showing an even more challenging envelope as one of the proposed ones. We have a meeting with the South East London CFOs on Friday. So I should have some further information for everybody next week once we've had that particular piece of work. But we are going to have, I think it will be challenged. And the only thing I would pick up is it's more than the finances. So last year, the reason we had the haircut on our capital was because as a system, we under-delivered on the UEC targets. So it's both performance and finance. And the performance is very much in the acute trust arena. But we will have an impact of that if that then flows through. I think the others, you'd really captured everything I would have said. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions? I guess there are also obvious interactions in the future between the PFI and the capital regime, but that is probably not for now. That is probably for the future to worry about. The cyber is an interesting one because I can't see a time when we won't have cyber as red, because the impact of cyber is so enormous. So in many ways, the question for the board is not whether it's red or not. It's always going to be red. But are our mitigations that we've got as good as they should be, as best we can guess, going forward? And so it's almost needing to ask a different question of cyber, not whether it's red or not, but are we confident that we are in as good a place as possible? Damien.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. Cyber is likely to remain red for the foreseeable future. Having said that, there's a question of the rating and the actual risk. We did increase the risk level, I think, after the Synovis incident. The risk is now elevated at 16. What would make us cut the risk a bit back to 14 or 12? And what are the sort of KPIs or the targets we have in mind to reduce that risk? I appreciate the risk is going to remain elevated, but it doesn't mean that we can mitigate it and cutting it down further.
I mean, I think that's a good challenge and a good question. And I also think that the risk evolves. So I think, as the risk evolves and incidents occur, that will change our rating as well. But I think it's not that we tolerate it, but it's that, we are doing everything we can do in terms of the context of the risk as we see it at a point in time. So I think that's probably something we would need to bring back to Vic.
And the other thing it's worth noting is the data toolkit that we have to complete every year is now much more cyber focused. So KPMG will audit that March time, or now probably. Oh, now is March, isn't it? Gosh. So that gives us some good benchmarking, so relative preparedness, I guess. And I guess we've already had one go at that because EY did some work across, was it the ICS or wider than that?
Yeah, it was ICS, and we're also developing metrics for the ICS actually. So we can share that once that's available too.
Abby?
I think the one thing we've noticed or we've learned with the cyber risk is also the clinical risk associated with it. So depending on what happens, there's a kind of clinical consequence to it and possible harm. And we usually don't know that, unfortunately, till it happens, but we will mitigate as much as possible.
Thank you. Suzanne?
So I think the discussion about the cyber risk and some of the other items which come up from BIC does pose a question for me about what we use in the BAF for, because that cybersecurity risk is never going to go away. Are we going to be using the BAF in order to keep the pressure up on Alison and her team? Is that the purpose? Is it to just show that we're aware of the risk, because we can't take it off because we would look like idiots if we didn't recognise a cybersecurity risk? So I was kind of thinking about that, but also then, there's another risk on here which is very low, which is revenue and capital plan delivery. Why have we got that on the BAF if it's a low risk? And I mean, I've been thinking about this since we had the discussion at Quality Committee about whether or not the harm to the triangle of care should be a BAF risk. I was persuaded by my colleagues that it shouldn't be, because the purpose of the BAF was to do something about the risks, which wouldn't kind of otherwise be being done in other places. And it was thought that it was being dealt with elsewhere. And I think that what would be useful as to come out of this review would be to think whether or not the BAF really does reflect our key strategic risks, and whether we're looking at risks or whether we're looking at issues, because cybersecurity is just an issue. It's never going to go away. There'll be levels of escalated risk and reduced risk. But thinking about what Abby had said in relation to the clinical impact, that in the way in which the risk is formulated at the moment, it's not about the clinical impact and how we're going to mitigate that. So I just wonder whether this might be something that we would like to look at as a board going forward.
Thank you. And I can see Iffy looking to jump in there.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And Suzanne, you're absolutely right. I think we need to When and I had a conversation, I think it was last week, about this, and it's something that we need to return to as a board to see how much further clarity we can bring to the use of the BAF. So the examples you give there, really good example, right? The triangle of care and our capital and our revenue. And I don't think it's any secret that in the NHS, we very quickly move towards the finances, and we don't always articulate or share the clinical risks. And I think that also speaks to Abby's point. I've often struggled with the cyber risk because Alison and I, whenever we talk, we appreciate it's always going to be there, but it's more about what is it we're doing and how can we constantly refresh and remind everyone of what we're doing. I'm not convinced that every time there's an incident, the risk should rise. It should only rise if it's a risk that we haven't considered, that's now been brought to our attention because there's been evidence of vulnerability. Alison will hate me for what I'm about to say, but she's been nominated as the Executive of the Year for an award as the Cyber Executive. And so I hope that what that means, Alison, is that we can count on you to draw our attention based on whatever you're hearing. But just to echo your point, Suzanne, we need to bring this. So when and I will have a discussion, perhaps engage execs, and then we'll bring it to a separate board. I would have thought a strategic board to really think it through. That would help us. Thank you.
So I think that's a really helpful thing. So we'll go forward. We'll have a look at that and understand what we're doing. And I also quite like the idea of making sure that we flush out these other risks, these other consequences of the risks, such as clinical harm and things like that, as part of that. Jo.
Yeah, I think it's probably overdue. I think the end result of that will be that we'll keep cyber on the risk register, but perhaps redefine it.
Yes, absolutely, and make sure that we're looking at the things underneath that are important, and accepting that there is some element of it where, Suzanne, you're right. We would look like like idiots if we didn't have cyber on it at the moment. Therefore, it does have a dual risk. It's not going to be a pure document in that sense.
And the other end of it, which goes back to that action that I said hadn't come back to the Business and Infrastructure Committee, that looked at the sort of Synovus type impacts as well in terms of knock-on effects, sort of indirect, if you like. The other thing, just to reassure you, is the reason that the in-year financial risk is still on the BAF is that we've only just dropped it to low. We could take it off the BAF. I will tell you in 2 months' time, there'll be a new one, which will start high and we'll go from there. So, but yeah.
Yes, so there's permanent BAF, there's cyclical BAF, and then there's other ones. Okay, can we move on to quality? Is that okay, Ify?
So people will have noted that the most significant risk is the bed management risk, which is shared with the Business and Infrastructure Committee. The Quality Committee looks at this from a quality impact on quality, where in terms of the impact it may have on the quality of care as we try to drive our bed usage down. We continue to keep an eye on that in the committee. There has been a discussion with Vicky's team about whether or not some of the wards which are more successful in reducing bed usage are beginning to slide into a rather transactional approach to patient care, and it's something that we're keeping an eye on. It's not something that is being sort of formally reported because it's more of we are concerned this may be the case rather than having clear clear evidence, and we're working with the wards where we think that that might be an issue anyway, and that'll come up later in the Quality Committee report. The South West Prisons service quality, people will have noted that we're proposing to close the risk in its current format. I'd like to take the opportunity to recognise that there's been such an amazing amount of work with the prisons in the South West by the executive. There was at one point I had a conversation in private where I thought, should we just junk this? Let's give the contract back to NHS England. And I would really want to recognise how much work has gone into changing the risk profile. What we now recognise is that with the pressure on the prison system, it's extremely difficult to be delivering high quality healthcare, whether it's in the South West or whether it's in Kent and London. And so we're looking at reformulating that risk to recognise that it comes up in a different form, and it's very much about the partnership that we need to have with prisons.
Yeah, thank you. Just to build on what Suzanne has said, I think in terms of the prisons, I completely agree with what Suzanne has already mentioned. So if we are going to have a risk about quality, we no longer need to single out the South West. I guess I was just reflecting on an earlier conversation about what we use the BAF for and what is on the BAF. And this is a good example of where we have a set of issues which relate to having to deliver healthcare in a particular context, and how, to what extent that context impinges on what we would like to do. So I think it will be an interesting discussion when we do formulate that risk around, if we keep it on the BAF, how we describe it, and then what the mitigations might be. And then in terms of bed management, yes, the trajectory for the delivery of the bed recovery programme has shifted, and we've talked a lot about that, both quality and business and infrastructure, and here at the board. So I think we want to redraft that risk, acknowledging that the trajectories have changed slightly, and we'll certainly be bringing both of those things back, hopefully, at the next round of committees. Yeah.
Any questions on the quality? In that case, if you, with your permission, I'll move to Peoples and Rachel.
Thanks very much. So building on Suzanne's points, these are all issues rather than risks. They are all things that we grapple with on a day-to-day basis within the organisation. But nevertheless, they are risks that are identified by each of the directorates in their operational reviews as well. So they're certainly live risks within the organisation. So I'm planning to speak to 1213 and 1471 in terms of discrimination and staffing. Jane, do you want to speak to the violence and abuse one, or I can, whatever you prefer? Okay, lovely, thanks. So the recruitment, the staffing risk. So this is will always be, I think, a huge risk for NHS organisations. We have reduced it, though, from 16 to a 12, and that's to recognise the fact that we have managed to reduce turnover and vacancy on a sustained basis now for over a year. So we are generally in a better position when it comes to vacancies, but we still know that there are pockets of really difficult recruitment areas that really impact on our ability to deliver the quality of care that we want to be providing. So what can we do about it? As you know, we have as a central big priority in our strategy is to make Oxleas the best place of work for us to be an employer of choice. And our approach is to build on programmes which have already been successful. I'm a strong believer that you don't kind of abandon things when they're starting to work. You have to kind of double down and keep going with them. So building a fairer Oxleas, your wellbeing matters, our values, all of those are things we need to, as I mentioned earlier, kind of double down on as we go through quite a difficult period that we have ahead. But there are two particular bits of our new people strategy that we're going to be taking to be finalised at the March People Committee Board that I want to highlight in this context. So one is around induction. So we know that we lose too many people in the first 12 to 18 months. So we're doing a lot to make sure that we catch those people, understand what their concerns are and are able to address them, and to make sure that people's induction really is top notch. We also want to be improving career development. So all the data shows that people come to Oxleas to develop their careers, and we want to make sure that we make good on that promise. We've got a big Smashing It programme, which people are responding to really well, which is about staff sharing their own top tips and experiences about career development. We're not bringing in some fancy external kind of provider. This is about Oxleas people sharing their own experiences and ideas about how we improve these areas. We're also focusing on career development conversations. So we know that there are some brilliant career development conversations happening in some areas, but not in others. We really want to improve the quality. So retention, if we break all the things that are good about Oxleas over the next 2 years, we will have some real problems. So the challenge that we have is to, as we've discussed already, is to deliver those savings but retain it as an employer of choice. And I really think we can do that. So that's what I was going to say about the staffing pressures. Discrimination, we've had our Building a Fairer Oxleas work has been ongoing, and it's slow, but we are steadily making progress on nearly all of the indicators. So that's moving in the right direction. Building a Fairer Oxleas services is also a key part. So I think helping people to understand the join up between staff experience and the quality of care that we provide is really important. So that it's really important that Building Fairer Oxleas services and Building a Fairer Oxleas overall work together really well. The Smashing It programme about career development was designed by a BAFO group and something that we did with the Mayor of London. And that, as I've said, has been very well received. But I wanted to highlight one thing that Neil and I have been working on, which is that it's all very well us fixing Oxleas for the future so that our processes are fairer, so that people have better experiences. But we have a lot of people in this organisation who have already been broken by their experiences, who perhaps aren't giving what they could, aren't achieving to the level that they are capable of because of their past experiences. So we need to be doing things that help people to rebuild as well. And one of the areas that has been most powerful has been getting people involved in redesigning our processes to become designers of how we approach these things. And the restorative impact of that has really taken our breath away, hasn't it, Neil? It has been people's ability to use their difficult experiences to design things that are better for the future has had such an impact on them. We think this is something we want to do more of. It's something we're doing around racism, something we're doing around investigation stress, but I think there's something quite magic in there that we can be doing more of in the future. So I just wanted to highlight that area. Jane, over to you on violence and aggression.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm pleased to say that in terms of the violence and abuse, we have excellent engagement at every level in every directorate, and this is really from the senior management teams and the champions who are driving the work within those directorates. So there is really good monitoring, oversight, interrogation and responsiveness about any of the incidents that are happening, and it varies according to which directorate, the frequency, the type. For example, more acute settings, inpatient settings have more. They deal with it frequently. Nevertheless, the impact on some of our services where they see less, such as in community services, the impact is just as much on the individuals, and it's being taken just as seriously there. There's been a number of listening events, going back to Neil's point earlier. The senior managers, for example, in the children and young people, have to give a shout out to Lisa Thompson and Bex Mortimer. They have done a wonderful job hearing about people's experiences and trying to respond to them and develop their proactive plans to address these. There's been Swartz round focused on people's experiences, and these are continuing and increasing. We've got a focus on prevention, so we've got the Keep Me Safe campaign, we've got the 4 Ps, which are well embedded, and we've been doing a lot of work collaboratively within the organisation and across London through the safety and equalities improvement in mental health work that NIDU leads on, and also the Culture of Care Collaborative, which is going across a number of services. We continue to work closely with police, and that's an area that we're going to have to work even harder on at the moment, because we know that there have been some changes within some of our local police arrangements, and Operation Cavell has been something that we've valued very much over the last few years. Other areas that we have been developing to support this work is another shameless plug for the professional nurse advocates, because they really are helping people when they have experienced difficulties. And finally, a piece of work that is or has moved into this field is the sexual safety and sexual misconduct work. And this straddles sort of people and quality, but predominantly we're taking it through the people route. So we'll be able to add that as an extra to the BAF in due course if we need to. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot going on. Manisa.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, Rachel, for your description of the vacancy risk and for all the work that's been going on in this area. This relates to our discussion about issues versus risks, and I appreciate it get picked up in that conversation. When I look at this risk as described, it seems very present. So right now we have these vacancies and retentions and how we address it, and I wonder if this is also meant to capture, or if we have any views on the risks over kind of the long term. So just, as an example, if we have a lot of staff that are due to retire in 10 years, and currently, we need 10% recruitment, but we will suddenly need 30%. If the work that we're doing, this risk captures that, and how significant that would be.
Thanks, Manisa. It's a really good question. So we do periodically have a bit of a deep dive into the kind of the workforce plan and where the risks might be. And one of the risks that we identified when we looked into this about 2 or 3 years ago was particularly the age demographic amongst our nurses. Of course, we can't ever be sure when people are going to retire, because I think most of our nurses are over the age of 46, and we looked at this at People Committee at the last meeting. We can't be sure that they will retire at a particular time, and indeed we're doing our very best to try and encourage people to stay within the organisation and not to go. So we do have a bit of an age demographic issue in the organisation, but a lot of work is ongoing. I don't know if Jane wants to come in on any of those areas on the nursing side.
I think on a positive note is our pipeline of newly qualified staff coming in. We are able to provide them with posts, and we've had a huge number come into district nursing, for example. We do run really good programs, Preceptorship Plus, which develops them and then keeps them. And we know that if we keep our staff for the first 2 years, they're likely to stay with us, or at least go away and come back again with greater skills. So we really invest in that early career as much as the retention period of those who are, much more experienced and mature. So we're looking at a sort of multifaceted approach at trying to make sure that Oxleas remains the place that people want to work and have their nursing careers for life, and can develop at all stages of that to try and mitigate some of those risks.
And I would just also add, Manisa, that we seize every opportunity to think of new ways of plugging gaps. So when there are new apprenticeships that are available, when there are new career pipelines that might be available, we try and build those in and take advantage of them. One area of some frustration is there is currently a little bit of a hiatus about some of the work around the workforce, the NHS England workforce plan, and some of the things that they identified in terms of the pipelines that are needed. My hope is that that will all be resolved when the 10-year plan discussions happen in kind of March to the summer, that sort of time. We'll start to see that. But it's a bit difficult to know what those pipelines will look like going forward. I think, Abby, you might have wanted to come in on the medical side.
Thank you, Rachel. I did want to come in on that in terms of pipelines, because NHSE's work plan had different ways of people entering professions that were traditionally very difficult for them to enter. So the medical workforce apprenticeship has been paused. We don't know whether it will resume. And there's something about market forces as well. So Manita's question was interesting because I was thinking about it. It's not just about the pipeline. It's the world is a village. So if you train in England in health, you are wanted elsewhere in the world, and they will offer much more. There's about the market forces as well, which tend to change. I'm old enough to know doctors from England went to Saudi Arabia in the 70s and 80s, and now they're going to New Zealand, Canada, Australia. So we need to consider market forces in what we do with vacancies, and that's the same for nursing, AHP as well. So it's like the cyber risk, it will continue to fluctuate, and we'll need to think about mitigations along those ones.
Thank you. Perhaps I could ask one question, if you, and hearing these very great initiatives on the restorative work and the safety against violence and abuse, what does it feel like to be one of our members of staff and see all of these different initiatives? Does it look like lots and lots of different initiatives, or does it look like something I could relate to as a member of staff, as something that looks at me in a holistic way?
Silence in the room.
If I answer that from a board visit type of review, so I went to the integrated school teams in Greenwich last week, and they do see all this and they understand it and they know how it applies to them. They didn't see it as different things. And I've been visiting other teams and they can tell me what is going on, and some people see it. It doesn't make the experience less difficult for some people, but they do know that we are doing work on it and how they can access that.
Yeah, I agree with that, Abby. I think it's variable. In some places, people are able to see the scope of things we do, can speak to it and feel it relevant to them. So that's also about the degree to which we're able to reach every part of the organization. But of course, in some other places, people don't quite see it, and you have to constantly remind them of the work we're doing. But on a more personal note, you can imagine that if someone has been assaulted, the degree to which they will think that all the work we're doing is helping them would depend on the assault, who they are, what happened before, and what support they get, etc. So it is quite variable. And what that says to me is that we'll have to continue to push this and continue to share with staff the effort and to hear from them whether in fact the things we're doing are really addressing their individual experiences.
Thank you. Sally.
And just to say, from an internal communications perspective, we try and support this with a very much a kind of campaign approach to staff, so that the information comes through in a coordinated way, and having it as a priority of our strategy, the best place to work, has enabled us to sort of brand things together. And we've just introduced a new publication that really tries to bring all these elements together. So there's one place that staff can go to see the opportunities that are available to them.
Sure. Thank you. That's very helpful, and I feel very assured by that.
Sorry, just had a couple of extra points, if that's right. Kind of building on Sally's one. It is really hard for any of these initiatives to land with the organisation because people are in really exceptionally busy day-to-day jobs. Lots of people don't spend very much time on their email or their intranet because they are doing real stuff with patients. And so how much it actually penetrates the organisation is really important, that we don't sit back and think, oh, we've got a nice campaign there. It looks lovely and glossy, therefore it's making a difference. So I would say one of the reasons that we don't come up with a whole host of new, fresh branding and ideas is because it takes years and years for this stuff to land. So we try and keep the existing programmes fresh, but they are the same programme. It's still Building a Fairer Oxleas. It's still Your Wellbeing Matters. Those are the elements that we still focus on. But I just wanted to say that I'm on a development programme at the moment that involves me having a staff mentor, and it's a fantastic guy called Abiola who works in the Learning Disability Service and who's involved in the InReach programmes into acute and crisis. And one of the things we're going to be working on when I'm shadowing him is exactly what people do here and what the best way of communicating is with people who are in really busy frontline roles. So it'd be really good to report that back to the board as we take that forward.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and it's one that one's never going to get 100% right, but one's got to do the best we can. Hence the question. Thank you, Iffy. Back to you for anything else you want to say on this paper.
Thank you, Chair. I just realised that we were given 5 minutes on the agenda for that item. I do apologise that it's taking more time, but I think it's the right thing to do. Here are the top risks in the organisation, and it was right for us to spend the time we spent just walking through them all. I have nothing more to add. And we'll try and make up from the other agenda items.
We'll try and make up for it. But my reflection is also that to some extent we talked about the risks, but we've also ended up talking about areas of importance to the board, like people, like business and infrastructure, almost the work of the committees, but as a trust. And so maybe we need to think about a way as we bring those straight into the conversation. I mean, rather than necessarily putting them under a BAF format. I think it's been a useful conversation though. Okay, thank you. Well, you've got my report next. Looking back, it seems like an age since our last formal meeting in January. I was looking back through my diary to prepare this report, and it was almost a different world. Trump hadn't, well, I can't remember whether he had been put in power, but it was still the early days. And I've visited many services. I won't list them all because I'll probably end up forgetting one or not saying one, but been really helpful to see a diversity of services as chair across it. And there's several things that have come out. First of all is that there is a lot of innovation that goes on in this trust, and actually seeing some of that innovation go on. Some of it is technologically driven. I mean, there's the Sim Baby. I think we've got the second Sim Baby in community in the acorns around the back here. And the team's really thinking through what they're going to do with the Sim Baby. Is it about training? Is it about helping parents understand the needs of their children? Lots of things that they're doing, but some interesting innovation there built around technology, but also work that has come up bottom up, so going to Goldie Lee and being involved in the opening of the Trim Trail, which the Children and Young People Service there have got. And from what I can see, with the help of a lot of people, some people around the table have managed to excite little bits of money here, there and everywhere to build together something which has taken a lot of effort to put together, but enables the children to have OT, young people to have OT and physio in the open air in a play setting, which I thought was marvellous, showing some of that one. And speaking as well to the James Willard and his CCIO or assistant teams around digital and how they're bringing that forward. So a lot around that one. Also picking up a lot of frustration amongst members of staff around paperwork and the way in which they are seeing fewer patients than they used to see back in the good old days. Now, of course, some of that is going to be perception, but some of that's very, very real. And understanding how our processes frustrate people doing the job that they want to do. And I think we've heard some of that before. And I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on as a trust. It's not always within our gift, but sometimes interoperability things, and talk to Alison about it, they are great. Sometimes people put barriers up that don't need to be there. I don't think particularly us, but other people can too as well. So there is a frustration there that I think we need to do. The other thing that we've done, if you might be touching on it, is we had a meeting since then about Queen Mary Hospital here, Sidcup, and how it might be used for more strategically for the ICB. I think that's actually picked up some conversations and got us thinking about other ways in which the estate here could be better used. or even better used, I think I should say. I was going to say something about the workforce. I will say something about the workforce because one of my other hats, as is declared and known about, is I sit on the Workforce Training and Education Committee and indeed the Performance Committee for NHS England on the workforce. And it's a real issue at the moment that where we have had a long-term workforce plan, which is frankly paused while we wait for the 10-year plan, and it's really difficult to think through how are we going to drive that forward. And I think we are waiting now for the 10-year plan before anything changes. I think there's some other bigger issues as well around there, and that is that however we design the future workforce plan, we need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need more allied health professionals, we need more people in finance and HR and everything else. That is the future of the NHS. We have an increased need. People are going to have to work differently, etc. But we are going to need more people. That means that we are going to have to train more people. And so I think as we think about keeping staff costs down, how do we keep staff costs down while keeping the training pipeline open? That means there will still be the people in our services. How long does it take to train a doctor, Abby? About 13 years. How long does it take to train a nurse? 6. And it would be the same for most AHPs as well, won't it, Neil? So that, we've got to think about how do we keep that pipeline going. And I think that we need to think through in our education how we help keep that pipeline moving forward for the future. I've attended lots of meetings. The only one I was going to share, just because it's a little bit different, and I think it's a sign of direction of travel, is I attended one interesting meeting that's the beginning of a series on how the NHS interacts with the local economy. And I think that's something that we forget sometimes, that we are a major player in the local economy very passively because we employ a lot of people. We are often going to be the biggest single employer in an area, not always, but we'll be up there as one of the largest employers, and therefore we do have an impact on the economy that way. But also thinking about more actively, how do we contribute to the local economy in the way in which we make our purchase decisions, where we tender things, all of those sorts of things. So I think that's going to be something that I'm hearing is increasingly important, and something that I know Suzanne's attends a meeting around this, but that's something I think will become more important for the NHS, thinking how it interacts with the local economy. So that was a bit of a random walk through things. I'm happy to give more detail to anything, but I'm assuming people don't particularly necessarily need a long list of every meeting I've been to. Otherwise, we could market it as a cure for narcolepsy. Any questions or comments? No, in that case, Iffy. The time is now. I suggest perhaps that after Iffy's report and before Ian's report, we have a little break so that people are refreshed for Ian. So Iffy, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for that update. In fact, as you talked about Queen Mary's, I thought, oh dear, it's not in my report. Not quite sure why that is. So you have my report. I don't intend to go through every detail, but there are 2 really important updates in my view, perhaps 3, but all 3 of a national update that I want to draw attention to. I think the first is Amanda Pritchard's resignation, which the NHS is still coming to terms with and trying to make sense of. You will know from the press, but also from my report, that Jim McKay has been appointed as a transitional CEO. The tenure is probably for 2 years. And the question, of course, is what does this mean? One of the things we know, which was raised by Amanda in one of her meetings with all chief execs, along with the Secretary of State for Health, is that the NHS is going to be slimmed down some more. So the term transitional gives the impression that he's going to hold the post for a period of time, moving from what we have now to something new, the details of which we're yet to understand. But I think that what that signals is more direct oversight of the NHS from DHSC and the Secretary of State himself. He has, over in the last month alone, has had 2 meetings with our chief execs and has said he is going to put in more meetings in the diary to talk with us directly. The slimming down is all about driving productivity, driving efficiency and value, but also making sure that we're all pulling in the same direction. And that direction is direction that the government will state and would expect the NHS to follow suit. And again, only this morning, I learned that the National Medical Director has also signaled his retirement, resignation, whatever it may be. And so we're going to see more and more people who are national leaders who work with NHS in England, the national team, stepping down towards that drive to slim them down. The second thing I wanted to draw attention to is the publication of the 25-26 priorities and operational guidelines. It's been in the news, and so board members would know something about it. But just to highlight key messages, one, of course, is the reduction in the number of targets in there, prioritizing timely access to care. When you look at what's in my paper, real emphasis on productivity, 4% is what was said, but also additional material and focus on what improved productivity would mean for mental health and community health. We're waiting additional publication on that. There's a real expectation, I was going to say desire, but I think it's expectation that we live within our budgets. And the meeting we had a week ago, chaired by the Secretary of State, was more about people highlighting what they think we need help with to enable us to live within our budgets. 1 or 2 were suggesting that safe staffing is contributing 16 billion to our costs. And so what do we do about that? So people are really thinking about big things that I'm not necessarily convinced that the NHS will be able to manage without perhaps the CQC or other regulatory bodies. And there was a lot of talk about expectations of regulatory bodies, including professional bodies. There's also the expectation that systems will have greater control and flexibility, both in terms of how resources are managed, but they will have more say. And I think that in part 2 of our meeting later today, we'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit more and perhaps at a more granular level about the efforts that are being made across our system with respect to the submissions for this month. I just want to draw attention to the publication of perceptions of health and care. And the reason I thought this important is that if you look, you find that we've talked about the 10-year plan. Does the 10-year plan, we've made reference to the 10-year plan and what it's going to do. And there's been a great deal of talk about how the public need to contribute to discussions and the reshaping of the NHS. And yet, from that survey conducted in November of last year, you could say it's a timing issue. About 70% of people in England were unaware of that, of the 10-year plan. And so it raises questions about the degree to which we can confidently say that people are giving feedback, they have an understanding of the changes that are needed, etc. I just thought I'll raise that. And then, of course, you see that in the 10-year plan update in my paper, it talks about what the public are thinking of. Again, this is perhaps 20-30% of people, if that, what NHS think, etc. I wasn't going to go into anything else, but of course I'd be happy to take questions. And that's not to say that there aren't other really important things in my report. They're there, but they're there for you to read. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ife. questions, comments, either on what he's talked about or on the other papers or other parts of his paper? Manisa.
Thank you, Iffy. This might be a question for Rachel. Just on the feedback from the 10-year plan from the NHS staff, have we triangulated some of the questions that the staff may have contributed to versus what we ask in our staff survey? So the challenges they've identified, are we confident that we've asked the right questions to draw out the understanding of those? And I'm looking particularly about, the staff concern about the disconnect between management and frontline staff.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't seen the detail of those responses, but I think it will be well worth us seeing whether or not those themes exist here in Oxleas as well. Certainly, I can't speak to the detail of the staff survey in a public forum, but we'll be able to look into that in May. And the initial indications are that that's not an area of concern in Oxleas in the same way that it might be in other areas too. But it's certainly worth us asking those questions. And I look forward to drawing those out when I present on those elements at the May board, if that's okay.
Sure. I think Rachel is absolutely right that there are timing issues in terms of a discussion, but the disconnect I would class as evidence of engagement or lack of engagement. And it's fair to say that in Oxleas, our engagement score has consistently been high. And I'm really quite pleased that that's the case, and we continue to push for that engagement. And of course, the comments we made earlier when Andrew started the board and asked questions about our values, in terms of how we're going to navigate the next couple of years, we have to do everything to make sure that there is no disconnect, between our management teams at every level and frontline staff.
Thank you, Iffy. Suzanne, did you have one or?
It's a quick comment about the point that Iffy makes in his paper about the postgraduate, the review of postgraduate medical education and training. This has also been on the GMC's sort of long-term planning, and I think all the indicators are that there's going to be a move both from the collective national bodies and the regulators to introduce far more flexibility into provision for postgraduate education, and that will also be significant for locally employed doctors and our SAS doctors. And I think that that's something to look forward to. I mean, I think it would really, really help, but it's also long term, and it would take some time for things to work through the system. But I think that one of the interesting questions that's arisen within GMC is how much of an appetite there is in providers to want to pursue and support and facilitate change, because it'll be, there's substantial changes if you start to shift the way in which doctors complete their training. So I wanted to pick up that one. And the other thing I was just going to ask is that I'm pleased to see that we're going to be celebrating the LGBTQ History Month and the National Apprentice Week celebrations. I'm not sure, are we going to be celebrating International Women's Day? I'm really pleased to hear that, because people may have noted that the medical profession has just reached gender parity or sex parity. So there are now 51% of the members of the medical register are women, and it's taken, I think, 175 years to get that far.
Thank you so much for that. And on your last point, increasingly we have more women going into medical school. So, in the next 5 to 10 years, I think you'll find that there'll be far more women doctors than there are men doctors. But thanks for raising that. I mean, your point about the postgraduate medical training review is an interesting one. There has been discussion somewhere about trainees complaining about the amount of service expectations put on them as opposed to training. There's also been complaints about the fact that they don't spend enough time in their clinical placements to work in multidisciplinary teams to get to know the service, get to know the team before they move on. And so I really am looking forward to the feedback that trainees, because we often think of trainees, certainly in Oxleas, and I would hope elsewhere, as people who will give us a sense of what our organization is like, both in terms of how they're welcomed, how their views are received, their contributions, etc. So I personally would want to know more as that work gets going.
Yes, one of the things I'm keen in that area as well, with my NHS WTE hat on, is to also make sure that they're prepared for being a consultant rather than just being a doctor at the next level, because I'm not sure we always help them make that jump into being a consultant, and it can be quite difficult. Abby, was this on that point? Because Azra has a point. In that case, on this point, and then Azra after that, because it's...
So, Suzanne, we are contributing towards that feedback as an organisation, so we'll do that. We've already seen changes in postgraduate medical education with a lot of our trainees, probably now about 40% wanting to do less than full-time training. It doesn't matter which gender, we've started to see that. I think we will need to look at what the impact will be on each provider organisation, and maybe it will take a few years, but it will come with a financial impact, and we'll need to think about that. And in addition to what we hear from trainees about service, it's also about things like their pay not being on time, if they're married to another resident doctor, not being in the same part of England and not being able to rotate. So there are various things. But just to assure people, most of it, if not 80% of the doctors in the trust trained at this trust. So people do still stay. I trained here and I'm still here. So.
Thank you, Azra.
Was just drawing out the day of our International Women's Day celebrations. We couldn't book a venue for the 8th, so we'll be having ours on the 17th at the Bexley Social Club, just behind Pinewood. So any members of staff that are listening to this, you are all welcome to come and join that in person.
Thank you. It's sort of special when we have our own Women's Day on it. Shows an independence of spirit, which is good. Any other questions for Iffy on his report? No, in that case, I'm going to suggest. Oh gosh, I'm going to suggest we break until 10:02, so we have slightly over 10 minutes to get coffees wherever we are and to stretch legs. Thank you. Okay, Ian, the board operational report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Morning, everyone. So you will have seen that in the reading room attached to the papers, there's a detailed report from each of the directorates, and in the board papers, as usual, I've summarised each of those reports. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things from the directorates. The first, and those of us that have been around for a while will know how long this has taken. I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that the HMP Wandsworth Healthcare Facility has finally opened. That's 7+ years in the making. I've yet to visit, but I'm planning to soon. And then the second thing I just wanted to highlight from the directorates was around waits in children and young people services. For me, this sits alongside the bed recovery programme as perhaps the most important operational issue to get on top of. The directorate have made real progress in reducing some of our longest waits in CAMS, which I think is really, really good news. However, they still have a long way to go, both in terms of the kind of access targets, but also then getting people into treatment. And just by way of context, the measurement of access into CAM service will be changing. So we will be measured on a 4-week wait target for a meaningful contact. What meaningful contact means needs some kind of teasing out. But so we've got kind of quite a challenging situation within CAMHS, and then the kind of framework for that will be changing. The good news is I think that demand has kind of plateaued, and there's much better oversight of the process. So the executive met with the directorate last week for its kind of regular operational review, and there was a kind of renewed sense of confidence that we will get there. But obviously this is something that we will continue to monitor as an executive and up through the quality committee. The other kind of area around CYP weights is around diagnostic assessments for ADHD and autism. These weights remain quite significant. As Iffy alluded to in his report, there is a piece of work which I'm the SRO of across South East London to try and look at a different offer for the population of South East London. And I think we're kind of nearing a kind of blueprint for what that might look like. And we have a session with parents and carers next week to test out some of our initial thinking, but also to get a sense from them about their experiences and what they would like. So I just kind of highlight that as particular areas of preoccupation. And then in terms of the kind of more kind of cross-cutting issues, I've given you an update around the bed recovery programme. In terms of kind of admission and access to beds, we're really holding what I think is a kind of significant kind of line around who we admit and making sure that we admit purposefully. So I think I may have mentioned before that our conversion of unplanned presentations in ED to admission is roughly about 11%, which is quite remarkable in comparison with other London trusts. And one of the features that has really continued is that the balance of unknown versus known presentations of known versus unknown people has continued to tip along on the unknown side. So we're seeing more people that have never had any contact with mental health services coming to ED or being conveyed to us who are really, really ill. And I was discussing this with Aisling Clifford yesterday, and she was giving me a couple of recent anecdotes about how unwell some of these people are who we are then needing to admit to hospital. So I've mentioned on the front sheet that we are planning a piece of research to try and understand that demand a bit more and whether there are kind of opportunities we're missing to engage them earlier. But this might be an interesting piece of research to engage other trusts with across London, because one of the things that we notice is that when we have a surge of demand, it's pretty likely that other trusts in London are experiencing that as well. So I kind of just leave that with the board as something that we'd quite like to explore further. But the other thing about the bed recovery programme is that the main focus remains on trying to reduce our average length of stay, and we've agreed to try and focus that down to 45 days, which is still above where we would like it to be, but it is below where we're currently at, where the average is around about 60 days. So that is the real focus at the moment, and there's some detail in the report about how we're trying to address the variation that we experience between wards. In terms of neighbourhoods, that continues to develop. Discussions in all three boroughs about what that will look like. And in terms of the integrator role, where that is being taken forward, particularly in Bexley, and we're thinking about how the Bexley Care structures might enable us to do that. And just to add that I've been invited to join a London simulation design group, which is looking to hold the first ever neighbourhood health service simulation in May. And when I know a bit more about what that actually means, I'll tell you. But it's nice to be asked. And the other thing I kind of highlighted, because I thought it was important to bring the board's attention to this, we've been in a very unusual situation of having 4 patients from various parts of our forensic service being absent without leave. As I said in the front sheet, there's no discernible pattern, but it is very unusual that we have situations like this, let alone where a situation where we have 4 people. I'm glad to say that as an adjunct to what I wrote in the report, all 4 patients are now accounted for, and no harm has been caused either to themselves or members of the public. Obviously, I won't go into any further detail, but if there's anything colleagues want to ask, I'm very happy to pick that up in part 2. And I think I'll leave it there, but happy to take questions.
Thank you. Sophie.
Yeah, thank you. I had a comment, really. I was going to ask a question about the bed recovery research, but I think Ian answered that in his explanation. Really, really interested to see this. And I just wanted to think about our focus on preventative work and kind of linking to what Rachel said as well, not letting our focus slip away from this during the current and future uncertainties, because we know that preventative work, and that links to the presentation we had earlier as well, that lack of access can lead to increased acuity. So we do have unknown patients coming to us who are very, very unwell when we could have they could have used services earlier on in their journey. So it's just a plea really to keep that preventative focus. How do we continue to do that while at the same time recognising the need to live within our means? And I thought that was a really good example. If we can understand our population and understand why they are not accessing our services earlier, then we can better understand the bed demand, amongst many other things.
Absolutely agree with that. And I just wanted to say, whilst I'm sure it would be interesting to widen our research to other trusts, I wouldn't do that at the compromise of just cracking on and understanding that, because I think it connects with lots of different things. And, you know, we need to understand what's been happening to these people and who's been holding them, if you like, probably family and friends. The other question I just had to ask, and it's just my ignorance, Ian, is under adult community physical. It said, talking about the Better Care Fund, discharges from QE, it said this initiative has led to the development of a transfer of care hub. I just want to describe what that transfer of care hub is or isn't.
I mean, hub's a very fashionable term. So, I mean, it's not a new concept, and certainly for the Bexley and Greenwich system, we tried to develop something similar pre-COVID. Essentially, it's not a physical space necessarily, or it can be, but it's essentially just a way of bringing together the 2 local authorities, Oxleas and LGT, together to kind of design and then operationalize a better discharge pathway. I mean, there's a lot of focus in the system brought to bear around admission avoidance or ED avoidance, but I think from community physical health point of view, we feel there's a lot more that could be done around discharge, and so yeah, that's it essentially. Yeah.
Hi, so mine was in relation to the community mental health update and the complex care side, and it is actually much more about what's in the reading room rather than on the front sheet. not here, but I'd be interested to just relook at the length of stay there because it talks about a reduction, but when I was reading the figures, it looked like an increase. And then secondly, just picking up the characteristics of the majority of people that had come through with personality disorder being overwhelmingly white female, whether or not there was unmet need in other characteristics or if that is particularly from that area. And I just wanted to check the threshold criteria for the service.
Try and answer all those questions. Thanks, Ezra. So what's interesting actually is that I think in the past that group occupied more bed days than they do currently. So it's an interesting point about the length of stay. As a group, if they are admitted to hospital, generally they have a low length of stay, and that is part of the reason the service was developed, because there is a kind of clinical view that they are not best served by coming into hospital in the first place. And if we can try and do something to help them as a group, and they're not an homogenous group, deal with what life throws at them and their kind of response to it, then it would be better all round. So I think, although that is one of the kind of reasons we've developed it, I think it's, as time has gone on, that the kind of issue around kind of bed usage has probably receded, and it's more about, from a quality point of view, reducing their need to kind of come to ED and have a kind of crisis response. I mean, the point when I was kind of putting the report together and talking to Lorraine about it, the point about the demographics of this group is something that has always been with me, from when I was a clinician, that it was overwhelmingly that kind of demographic that was being diagnosed with EUPD, which I think is quite interesting, really, about whether, and I think it's something that is worth examining, whether there's an overrepresentation. I think the other thing to say, and Abby would know more about this, I think there's been, as a kind of diagnostic, there's been some kind of changes. So people who have had this diagnosis in the past have sought a second opinion, and a number of people have now been re-diagnosed as neurodivergent. So I think there is something shifting here as hopefully our diagnostic capability gets better. But it did really strike me actually as something to kind of think about. And there was a third question.
It was threshold
for
future service.
Okay, so I think as I understand it, the threshold around accessing the service is about the number of crisis presentations in a period of time. So it is it's really designed to try and reduce demand on crisis services, and then from a patient point of view, try and improve the kind of quality of what they get. Yeah.
Thank you.
So in terms of diagnosis, there are various theories as to whether there are issues within our systems and structures, which means a particular group gets a particular diagnosis. So if you use ADHD, what studies tend to show is that if you're from a white middle class background, you will get an ADHD diagnosis. If you're from an ethnic minority background, you will get oppositional disorder. So there are things like that which switch both ways. So and then as Ian was saying, the diagnostic criteria has changed. So people are getting a diagnosis more of neurodivergence, but also complex PTSD. So as we get more evidence, diagnosis changes as well. But there is also something about access, because we spoke about it earlier on today, that if communities don't recognize certain things, how would they come forward? Or so, we see that in CYP. We're looking at our access in CYP. So it's something we're already aware of and will sit within our health inequalities umbrella. So I think the research that you were talking about, we should just get on and do it and then build on our own evidence base.
Suzanne?
I just had a question about the standardising community health services guidance and what impact this is likely to have on us. I mean, as I understand it, the guidance is directing the ICBs to understand what they ought to be commissioning. But how far is the ICB commissioning consistently with standardised community services, and are we going to find ourselves in a position either that they say this service that we have been commissioning you to provide is not part of the standard menu, so we're going to stop, and equally there are other services which are part of the standard menu that we haven't been commissioning and that we really ought to now start up?
I can see if he has put his hand up, but he may want to come in. I mean, even before this guidance, there has been an attempt through the community provider network to articulate a core offer, and I think this guidance builds on that and kind of gives a bit of a mandate to push it further. Interestingly, that Better Care funded kind of system work that's alluded to in the report, I had a workshop with kind of system leaders, so the PELs and the DASs from the two boroughs. I mean, they're, because I think one of the kind of tensions, particularly around how delegation has taken place in South East London, is that there's been a kind of an emphasis more on variation to meet local needs at the expense of a kind of core offer. And I suppose it's finding that kind of equilibrium. I think having these standards is really helpful because it articulates that for the majority of people, this is what good looks like. And then you can kind of build in a tolerance for variation. And that's what I've been talking to colleagues about. I think some of their objection in the past to this idea of a core offer has been about the language. And but I think it will be interesting to see how it goes. I mean, if you kind of a member of the CPN, you might want to say more about how we're kind of taking this forward.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Suzanne. So I really think this is a positive thing. I genuinely think that. And Andrew will recall that he and I have had lots of discussions about how difficult it can be to understand community health provision, not just within the boroughs that we serve, but across South East London. And so this desire to standardize things will then help us ensure that we have at least the same nomenclature. We can then begin to define what people get based on where they are. I think it then makes it easier for us to capture the inputs, the outcomes, and then begin to relate all of that data to provision. And therefore, your point about do we want to fund more of this or less of that? So when I think about when virtual wards first came in just after COVID, and we're all being encouraged to drive that, different teams added different provisions into the virtual ward nomenclature. And so if you went to one place, the virtual ward will include this, that, and the other. If you went somewhere else, you include different teams. And so I am very keen under the auspices of the community provider network that we do this work, and we've given ourselves ideally the end of this month, probably not, but certainly by April, so that we can then begin to compare what's in Bromley to what's in Bexley, Greenwich, Lambeth, Lewisham, etc. So I really do see this as progressive and good.
Thank you. It's certainly something that Richard Douglas, as chair of the ICB, was talking to me about yesterday as well. It's a strong driver for them. So I think that's a good thing. Abby.
I agree with Iffy and Ian. So in terms of the core offer, we've seen improvement for our patient outcomes for both stroke and neuro rehab. And I can tell that by the audit that we do every year. And so the ones that we've done last year showed a marked improvement in terms of what is provided to the local community. The same with our diabetes teams as well. So it has been of real benefit to BBG community.
Thank you. Any last questions or comments for Ian? Not, thank you very much, as ever. We'll now move on to non-exec reports. And as we did last time, what I'll do is go around the table and indeed the screen, and then I'll invite any execs who went on board visits without a non-exec or whose non-exec is absent to comment. Sophie, can I just start with you as the first person round, and I'll go round in that direction.
Yes, thank you. We went to Oak Tree Lodge. It's really interesting to go to places that are relatively self-contained, have long-term patients who've been there, some for many, many years, and teams of staff who've also worked there for many years and work as a small, closed group, you could say. And I went there a year before with Azra and Alison, and it was really interesting to note that there was a difference, a significant difference. And Oak Tree Lodge has changed its clinical model. So it's moving away from those long-term patients who are there for many years. I think that's 2 years now that the advised length of stay. And the staff really seemed to have gone with that change, which was interesting. It could have gone a number of different ways, but the staff team were very positive. They felt they'd received a lot of support. And so, yeah, that was good to note. There was some uncertainty about the future of Oak Tree Lodge, but there was a recognition of transparency, that staff were being kept involved and supported throughout that. And the only other thing I think really to note was staff were really impacted by a serious incident that happened with a patient. And I've seen that a number of board visits as well, that we do offer support for our staff, but we just have to really recognise, especially when the patient had been known to those staff for many years. Again, it comes back to that long-term relationship. So it's interesting to note the specific needs of staff who are working with patients, the same patients for a number of years. Not to say that similar incidents don't affect other staff in other ways, but just to really continue with our aftercare support for staff who've been affected by that.
Thank you. And I guess that's something that forensics would also often share with place like Oak Tree, I guess, as well. Any questions? No, thank you, Suzanne. You're none. Manisa?
Thank you. So I visited the Greenwich Learning Disability team. I'll take the report as read, but just one of the points to highlight. I think the staff there were really complimentary of their of how well they worked with social care, and you can really see how when that relationship works, the benefit in patient care, but also kind of staff morale, engagement. It was very clearly a very positive relationship, and the touch points seemed very effective. So I'll highlight that. And you know, I didn't pick up on any sort of obvious reasons why it might work so much better there than some of the other places that we've visited, but there might be some learnings there.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? I guess Joe?
Yep, just one from me. So Jane and I visited Greenwood and Hazelwood, also on the memorial site. Very interesting visits, actually, very full visits. A few things to highlight. I'll take the report as read. Certainly there's been some issues around doors on that site. It was good to know that actually when we were being there, they were fixing those issues. So I think it may have had another few hours to go, but we're pretty much done. Staff also raised quite a few environmental issues in terms of, you know, in March and September, the heat in the building is about right. Other months it's not. But again, it's quite gratifying that seems to be a work in progress already. And it looks like we're looking at air conditioning as well for that. So that's quite good to know that things are being picked up without us having to raise them. A couple of other things to highlight. I think both teams were really beginning to challenge kind of, well, this is the way we do things. So, you know, when blanket rules have been put in place in the past, and in fact were encouraging the service users who were living with us, obviously for quite a long time, to also bring up, you know, to question some of the rules. So that was really good, using quite a lot of interaction, huddles and things like that. So that was good. And then the only other thing I'd highlight, I think I've mentioned it before, this issue of some of our forensic patients not being registered with a GP. So we provide GP services to them, so they get the services of a GP, but they are not registered with the GP, which means it's very difficult to then access quite a whole load of other services. So Honey was saying, you know, I'm going on leave and I'm coming back and I'm going to take some cake round to some local GP services to try and persuade them basically to get more revenue and not do any work. And it's one of those things where if you just look at it, someone who's not connected with the NHS would just go, surely someone just needs to press a button and that issue is fixed, and it would make a big difference. So if we can in any way try and see if anyone can fix that button, it's just a bit ridiculous. We've seen it elsewhere as well. That's all I was going to highlight.
Thank you. And it does seem a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? Does anyone, Abby, you look like you're summoning up a thought on this one?
I think we've tried, and maybe I don't know. Maybe what Hanit's going to do, food, is to weigh in to sort of, because we're willing to pay, so it will be a local Bexley or Dartford GP if they could take that on, because the patients come from all across South London. So in terms of their care, I think the other thing we probably could do is just that they're different ICSs, because that would have been the other way. We could maybe speak to our ICS or get them to speak to Kent, so that we can sort of have some kind of resolution, and probably do it under Health Inequalities banner, because you're on a medium secure unit doesn't mean you shouldn't be registered with a local GP. So we'll try. I'll speak to Hanit when she's back next week.
Yes, because presumably since we provide the health services, there wouldn't need to be a lot of work done by that GP, I would assume, but I don't know, maybe there is.
Especially now with the red tape challenge, you just need to have a registered GP, and then whatever else needs to be done, we can do it.
Yeah.
But as long as you have a registered GP, that would be fine.
Thank you. Yes, the NHS runs on cake bribery at times. Damien, I don't think you've been on a visit this time, no? We look forward to that one. Azra, I think you're covering a couple of visits that haven't.
I am. So Steve Dilworth usually used to accompany on these, but since he's left, I haven't had a Ned to partner on these. So 2 visits, both to Bexley services that were conducted. The first one was to Bexley Community Mental Health Rehab and Recovery Service. Recovery and Enablement Service. And the second one was to Bexley ICMP. I'm going to say 2 different facets of services. The first, CumRes, only a 45 caseload, whereas the other one had a 480 caseload. So 2 very different teams, both of them MDT, with different challenges, I would say. The first one, we just had a good discussion about vacancies with psychological. They'd had quite a number of psychology vacancies, and we've talked about perhaps having more of a trust-wide or entire service approach to some of those, because they were a bit piecemeal and part-time. We talked through, and both services, interestingly, brought up the depot and clozapine patients that they had on their caseload, and an inability to be able to discharge them from the service because there was nowhere to hand them over to. That was a small number of longer term clients for the first service, but for ICMP, they almost have this entire caseload of about 150 of the 480 caseload that are just simply on their caseload for that reason. So we had a discussion around that. We explored staff's experience of racism, and I have to say, interestingly, for CumRes, that was more from carers than from any service users, but they also picked up the prejudice that perhaps some of the neighbours of the homes that they visited also had issues of, why are we having this individual living near us. So that was an interesting dynamic, and we explored that to some extent. For ICMP, I think the key issue for them is about the workload associated with their high caseloads. There was, I mean, I've used a quote that they did say a bit of a dumping ground, they felt like, because they feel like they're the team that everybody goes to or everybody is referred to if there isn't another natural home in one of the more specialist teams. So we followed that one through and discussed that at some length. And then lastly, ICMP did bring up the issue about easy expenses, where they basically felt they weren't that easy and they had quite a number of visits to do. So I have said that I'm going to take that back and have a word with the team to see what is possible to resolve in that area. But I'm going to take the rest of that as read. That was the key highlights.
Thank you. Any questions or comments, Rachel?
Yeah, it worried me to see that people didn't know about the position on racism, and because the prevention and management of violence and abuse policy is really clear about what we can be doing in terms of tackling those issues with carers, staff members, patients, a whole range of people. So that did make, I mean, I'm glad that they're thinking about a QI project, but it did make me think a little bit about what more we need to be doing to bring that to people's attention. And I wondered if it might be something we discussed at the next managing violence and abuse meeting that we had, just to make sure that, I think we assume that people know this stuff, but maybe there's a little bit more that we can do. The feedback about easy expenses, it is a most unfortunately named system, I will say. But the difficulty we have, and I've looked into it, is that we don't have the most expensive one. It's one of the cheaper ones that are out there. We could certainly spend more on it, but that's not a straightforward option either. And at this time, I think people who get used to it don't find it so difficult, but people who use it more irregularly find it a bit tricky. So we are trying to fix that one, but there are some difficult issues about the balance between things that might affect people's productivity and things that affect cost. But I think that's a discussion we'll be having quite a lot over the next few months.
Yeah, the name is a bit of a hostage for fortune, though, isn't it, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, it was just to pick up on the point about staff's experience of racism, particularly from patients. I mean, it's something that Sophie, Rachel and I have picked up in crisis and inpatient services. And of course, I mean, I think we do have a fairly clear line on it, but of course, we're dealing with people who are sometimes very unwell, and that can be the context for some of that behaviour, not to excuse it. So the sanctions that you might want to put in place about removing care, we can't do that. But I think it's about how we and Rachel and I have talked about this, how we ensure that there is a discussion around when these things happen, and there's an opportunity for support, psychological support, and discussing it. Because I think from one of the particular visits that we did, it was really moving actually to watch somebody dealing with it with such skill and grace, frankly, and then talk quite openly about the fact that this is a patient, and so I think just navigating through that is quite difficult, but something we need to keep the conversation open about. I think the other point that you raised, Azra, about the experience our staff have of dealing with the community when it comes to serious mental illness is an interesting one. I was talking to members of the public earlier about their experience of possibly living next to somebody who is seriously unwell. And of course, people are stigmatized because of their mental illness, but often their behavior causes them to come up against their neighbours. And I guess we have a responsibility then to try and negotiate that and a good outcome for both the individual and their community. And both these scenarios are really difficult things to do, and it's really important. I think it's really helpful that you've identified that on the visit, because how do we then think organisationally to kind of support people with what are kind of probably daily issues? Yeah.
Just to say, what was interesting is it was almost skipped over in the visit, and it only just really when I paused and said, can we just explore that a little bit further? And then there was a huge upswell of commentary coming out through it. So I think there is something about us always keeping this live, which I think we are trying to do.
I think unfortunately for some stuff it's just become part of everyday experience, and in 80% of instances it's not overt racism. It's things like, can't you speak proper English? Where did you get your qualifications from? So quite subtle undermining type of issues. So yeah, so they maybe, and people just get used to it, unfortunately.
So on one visit I went to, people were talking about it, and they say, and we're told us to put a datex in about it, or I think that's what they said, and but that takes that takes whatever they thought it took. Is there a way that one can lower the threshold at which to make it easier to report or something? Is there something there that would be doable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an issue, and again, just building on Abby's point, depending on the setting, you can have people experiencing this constantly throughout the day. If we were expecting them to, so we're in a bit of a dilemma, because the datex is our way of kind of recording that this is happening, and that it's kind of making sure the organisation is cited on the extent of which it's happening, but it's not user friendly, and that's why then you get under-reporting, because it's experienced as being too clunky and just not kind of doesn't fit into colleagues' reality. If you're working in the mental health assessment suite at QE, you're not going to be putting a datex in for something that's happening every few minutes, potentially. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's something that we need to think through, get into a kind of solution around. Yeah.
And I think something that we also need to think about is the point that you both raised, which is around the stigma of living with mental health and neighbours' responses. And I'm just on a personal level, I was much moved last night because near where I live, we've long had somebody living in our community in a particularly florid way, who was well known to everybody in the community, and he died a few months ago, but there was an obituary in a local magazine about him, and the warmth and in spite of his evident difficulties, what he gave to the community through his presence was a really moving story. And I think there's something around how do we as an organisation help that say some of those stories as well, because Manisa.
Coming back to violence and racism against staff, I recall, I think there may have been 2 or 3 board visits where in the past, where when we've discussed this topic, staff have flagged that in particular the admin staff are recipients of this. So the kind of receptionists, the people who are organising appointments and stuff, and they deal with a lot of the frustration when there are delays. I don't know if that's something that we have a bigger picture on or any data to support that or not. But it may, if that is the case, it may be worth also considering when we refresh, violence and racism is relevant to all staff, obviously, but if there's a particular cohort that is experiencing it more, that we kind of target informing them and supporting them proportionally.
Rachel. And then we move on.
So I think one of the real advantages of having directorate leads for our Violence and Abuse Committee is that we're able to see the vastly different contexts in which these sorts of issues happen. So we talk, for example, about if you're a district nurse and you're in somebody else's home, that has a very different dynamic to perhaps if you're in an inpatient setting where you've got your colleagues around you. In some areas, you might expect people to be more regularly acutely unwell in a kind of health-based place of safety or Section 136 suite. And it's very different. And some people are answering a lot of things on the phone where people are getting very frustrated about waits. And that kind of means that the nature of the conversation is a lot more hostile than it might otherwise be. And I think we have such a range of different services right across Oxleas that understanding the particular pinch points and pressures for different groups is absolutely the right thing to do. And I do think that as a violence and abuse committee, we get visibility of that because we have each directorate talking about what happens in their particular local area. I think the key is how we recognise that this isn't okay without just layering more and more and more bureaucracy on people to fill out the forms in the kind of way that Ian is talking about. And one of the things we explored is whether there are particular groups that we might visit more regularly as board members or as members of the exec, just to listen so that people feel heard. I don't like the phrase zero tolerance, because we can't say that we have a zero tolerance approach to it, because we can't eliminate it. But what we can do is keep hearing people's experiences so that those people feel heard. And I think that's probably where we should start. And I think some of our frontline staff who answer the phone, people fall in that category, people who work in some of our most with some of our most acutely unwell. I think if we had a bit of a set of conversations, we could really listen, and then hopefully if there's anything more we could possibly be doing, we would be able to identify as part of those conversations.
Suzanne?
I just wanted to shift the conversation a bit. So if people want to go on talking about, okay. So this is a reflection actually on what comes up in the generality, looking overall at the reports. And I don't want my comments to sound too Pollyanna-ish, but I think that what we tend to focus on in our discussion coming out of these board visits are all of the problems that we see. And I think board visits are really important for that. You know, unless we are cited on the day-to-day problems that our staff are experiencing, then we can't do anything to resolve them. But I'd want to look at it the other way as well. Unless we're cited on the excellence that is being generated within these teams, we can't share it, we can't support it, we can't congratulate it, and we can't encourage it. And I'm reminded a bit of, in my teaching career, endlessly giving people negative feedback on their essays. You know, you would always point out the stuff that they got wrong. And it took me some years to realise that actually what they didn't understand was what a good essay looked like. And I wonder whether we might think of sort of shifting a little bit the way in which we approach the board visits to engage. And it may be that these conversations are happening, but I don't see it in the reports, to understand what staff are proud of, not generally, but in particular with the clinical care that they're providing. And I think this plays back to the point that we were discussing at the beginning about our values, that one of our values is care. And I want to hear more about the care that people are providing and the outcomes that they see their patients getting. And I think unless we focus on that, we're not going to hear it. And, you know, it's not just about making ourselves feel good as a board. It's about recognising the excellence in the organisation and supporting and promoting it and enabling people to be proud of the jobs that they're doing and their capacity to overcome the challenges that we're hearing about.
So I think that's a very good challenge. I think the question that leads to me is the so what, because the areas that were for development, we have then an action plan and a tracker to say, what are we doing? If you say something good, then we've got to think almost of what is the equivalent of that, which is what is the particular learning from this place that we could then apply more widely and think about it in that case, so that there is a so what to the good news and it's not just us basking in reflected glory. Sophie?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good challenge, because I was just thinking then, I do ask these questions, but do I bring them out enough in the report? And as you say, so what? We could talk about it here now, but how do we share that learning? So just reflecting on the visit I did, that team there had clearly understood and learned how to manage change and working under uncertain circumstances. That's really important learning as we go forward. Things like that, how do we capture them? How do we take them? And how do we actually use them? And without creating yet another DATIX form that has to be checked and signed off. So I think it's a really good challenge and something we should think through.
Okay, can we perhaps do a bit of thinking around that? That'd be good. Okay, thank you, everybody. Again, a good broad discussion, which I think has brought up some issues. We're now going to go to the reports of the committees, and I'm going to invite, first of all, Suzanne for the Quality Committee to summarise.
Thank you. I'm going to take the report as read, but I did want to pull out a couple of things which I anticipate people might like a little bit more information about. And it relates to the alerts. So the first alert was with a reference to concerns that we'd received from carers, patients and staff in relation to a couple of units, and then evidence which came up from an Improving Lives review on a ward. And we didn't put a lot of detail into the paper because we were trying to keep it short. But I think just to kind of summarise the things which were found and the items which are going to be addressed in action were, for example, staff attitudes and behaviour, a lack of engagement and of observations, poor care planning, poor medication management, insufficient attention paid to physical health care, and then some items about the environment, that it didn't feel like a therapeutic environment, that there was limited access to fresh air, and that people didn't feel that they were getting a high quality diet. Now, none of those are nice things to hear about our provision, but I did want to have a little bit of clarity for the board in there about the items which were picked up. And I think that the very positive response has been to take the three wards together to recognise that there are slightly different problems, but to work with all, slightly different underlying causes for those problems, but to work with all of them in a constructive way that really engage staff rather than just issuing them with an action plan. And I'm encouraged that I think that there is progress being made, again, sort of talking informally to the quality team, and that hopefully we'll be able to come back to the board and say we're satisfied as a committee that these aspects have been addressed. So, changing the direction of the remarks, we included a positive alert in our report, and I thought, is this what we're supposed to be doing with this? And I thought, well, why not? It's up to us to use our templates in the way that we would like, and we were really struck by the presentation that and feedback from Adult Community Mental Health Services, which was the last directorate that we looked at. And it's a service that is under tremendous pressure. There's huge demand and increasing demand, as the next alert will point out. But in spite of that and in the face of it, they're doing some really innovative work and are making space to do it. And the thing that I wanted to particularly draw attention to was the Dragon's Den initiative that they had. Because just to give you an example of some of the projects and things that staff wanted to do, they're going to set up a mindfulness group for gamblers. There were 5 initiatives for older adults, which were all focused on inclusion and go very much to our inclusion agenda. A physical health programme for people with serious mental illness. And what the overall comment was that from the directorate was that staff have been sitting on great ideas, that there was lots of thought about improvements which could be made, but that there hadn't been a forum really whereby those great ideas could come to the surface. And I know that for this directorate, that Dragon's Den initiative has been really important, and it may be that sort of other directorates might want to think of doing something similar. But when we were receiving the report, I think what really struck me was that these are initiatives and ideas that staff have for improvement. And hopefully they will also be able to engage with ideas for cost improvement as well as overall improvements, because it's obviously, it's the old point that they are the people who know how the services are delivered, how they could be delivered better, and in some cases perhaps how they could be delivered at less cost. So I did want to draw that to attention. And the other item, which was a limited term project, but which had amazing outcomes, was the rough sleeping team and the support which had been provided to rough sleepers. So the very last alert is just about the mental health hubs, and it relates to the discussion we were having earlier, I think, about unknown presentations of very acute mental unwellness to the ED. And the mental health hubs were hoped to be, I think, in some ways, a way of directing attention to concerns before they became too acute. And it's clear that those mental health hubs are meeting a huge demand, and that demand is one that at the moment, they're struggling to match. So we had a discussion at the committee about this, and whether there is a need to see whether or not there is any possibility of additional resources to meet that demand. So that's it for the alerts. And if anybody would like to raise points or questions about other aspects of the report, I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Questions for Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I recognise the conversation we had about the hubs. I think their creation has identified lots of unmet need, which they, as you say, are then struggling to meet. And as you say, linking that to who is presenting at ED, they may not be successfully meeting that need. I mean, I think their future will inevitably have to be kind of reviewed within the latest planning round, because in a sense they act as the front door into the wider mental health system, not a front door into Oxleas. And so we just need to kind of think about that, particularly if we're thinking about if we feel there's further investment needed, because for all the reasons we'll talk about later, that's looking quite difficult. So I think it's again a thorny issue that we will have to negotiate over the next few months, and I suspect it will be something that we will return to not only in the Quality Committee but also at Business and Infrastructure, about how do we right size them and what is our contribution to that. Yeah.
And Iffy?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Suzanne, for that. I think my comment really chimes with Ian's, and so you've touched on the mental health hubs, the high demand, and yet we see people we didn't know pitching up in AD, when our hope had been that might be the first port of call. So there's a question there as to how we position the hubs, or even what we've got in GP practices. But on Monday, at the South London Partnership Portfolio Board, we were looking at NHS 111 and our crisis lines. And there again, huge numbers coming through, particularly across our boroughs. The majority of them, anxiety, panic attacks, etc. So what this kind of suggests to me is that there's a real need in our communities for anxiety type depression, those sorts of conditions where people really need help. But there's a question about what is it then that a family who is struggling with someone with, say, psychosis or more pressing mental illness, how do they access the service? Is it because they can't access via primary care? Is it because they don't know about our hubs? What should we be doing? And are they confident that when they pitch up that will help them, because one of the things we say about ED is the lights are always on. There are always nurses there, always doctors, and so people would automatically go to ED. So there's still that work we need to do, and I think the presentation earlier in terms of where these people from in communities, how much confidence they have, how do we help them to find the help that they need, is one area that I have no doubts in my mind we need to focus our energies and our time. The challenge, of course, is as you come into financial pressures and difficulties, rather than reach out, often what happens is everybody looks inwards and tries to raise their threshold and reduce what's available to the wider community. So just a few reflections, and I can see the links between all of these things. And it's going to be stuff that I'm sure that the exec will be thinking and talking about and will bring to the board.
Thank you. Clear direction of travel. Joe.
Different topic. I just wanted to question about medication shortages. I heard something on the radio on the Today programme about this. So clearly the particular medications we talk about here impact individual patients, but I guess it's not the main body of medication that we use. But do we have a view about other shortages that might be coming down the track? And it's very worrisome.
Yes, we've brought this up at the Medicines Management Committee, and I brought it up at the Quality Committee because we've had we don't know which ones. We just hear a few weeks before. And in some instances, I think in some medication production stops. We don't know why. Maybe it's no longer viable from a business point of view. So we're just sourcing, and whenever you need to buy outside the NHS framework, is much more expensive. So there's a cost to it. So I have written to the regional medical director asking where the harm is, because in some medications we've had to change people from what they were using before. The ADHD medication was the one that was the most concerning so far. But it's a watch and wait. We don't know.
Okay. Can we turn to the Business and Infrastructure Committee? Joe, that's you.
So largely I was going to take the report as read and take questions. In terms of alert, we'll be talking more about it in part B. It's largely around the planning. In terms of the current year, as we've talked about already on the risk, we will hit our number for this year. We're not quite sure what that number is yet. There's a range, but it's within the sort of guidance we've talked about. The only one thing I was going to highlight, which is a very small thing, is number 4 on the assurance piece. So it says the committee noted a detailed analysis of the payroll corporate benchmark output. Doesn't sound the most exciting item that we could have talked about, but I think this is important. I think we need to do more of it. So there is quite a lot of benchmark data around. And we submit data, and then we get reports back. It tends to be somewhat out of date when we get it, and sometimes we question the quality. But this was a NHS benchmark report that came up and looked at our services across a range of areas and compared them to other trusts. And we noticed as part of that payroll looked expensive, which we were surprised about, because generally we're there or thereabouts, medium or a bit better. So SAT led a quite a detailed piece of work into that, which has led to us reallocating certain costs in a different way on future returns. So a step in terms of improving our data submission, and also highlighting actions that should improve our position on this as well. And I think we need to do more of that. We get a lot of data, and unless we and our fellow trusts start using that data, the quality will never improve. But I just thought it was really useful. It was a very thorough exercise. The reallocation piece made us then think, Rachel, some of that went from payroll to HR. So, no. So, what does that do and things like that. But it was a very good exercise. And as I said, I think we should be encouraged.
Thank you. Answer.
Just one other point that I would like the board to do. It's in the alert section. We're due to come to the end of the Mariposa House contract, and we're going to require delegation from the board to the BIC for the award of that contract. It's just the timing. We've done the STW section, so this is actual contract award. It's in part 2. Okay, great. So we'll be picking it up there.
In part, simple. Thank you. Any other points for Joe? It's actually good to see that data being used, because actually the model hospital was very acute focused, so it's good that it's becoming more useful to us. Rachel, would you be happy doing People's Committee?
Yeah. So I know that if Nina was here, she would want to highlight the fact that there has been an increase in kind of fire incidents in some of our acute wards, and we want to understand what's behind that. So what we observe is that the responses to the fire are really good, but there is some work to do about the kind of available sources of ignition. So in some areas where things like the presence of police makes a difference, health-based place of safety, that's all going very well. But there is more that we want to do around searches. So we're going to focus a little bit more time on that at each People Committee going forward. There are some really good bits of news, like the just under 2% decrease in medical vacancies, which is definitely something to be pleased about. Our staff survey completion rates are much, much higher than our peers, and that's important. We talked a lot about whether or not we're living our values, whether or not there's a gap between the leadership and our patient-facing staff. It means that when we look at that data, we can be pretty sure that it represents quite an accurate picture in the organisation. So that's the reason that these completion scores are important. It means that we can really act on them. Abby updated us that the thing that we've been worried about for a bit, which is that the plans to reduce resident doctors' numbers in London as part of a national levelling up agenda have been abandoned. So there might be other ways of redistributing them, but that's not going to happen immediately. We had some discussions about what we're doing around sexual safety, and there's a really big programme of work around that being led from within Jane's team, but in partnership with other teams too. And we looked at the Equality Delivery System report, which has been both to Quality Committee and to People Committee. It's a slightly odd report where it's agreed at South East London level what the kind of key theme that will be looked at is, which is why you have that kind of one more in-depth focus in the report that you can see that's attached. But I think that's what I'd mention. Thank you.
Comments or questions? I mean, yes, the Equality Report is helpful reading, but it's quite a bit random. Thank you. Damien, Audit and Risk Assurance, please.
The Audit and Risk Assurance Committee met on January the 21st. We had a good meeting. The main alert was on fire safety, as mentioned by Rachel a minute ago. We did talk about the mechanisms of assurance we had as a committee and then as a board to basically assure ourselves that fire safety is taken care of. So there's ongoing work on that. I think we're also linking that to the internal audit plan for next year. It's part of a long list of ideas we submitted to management. Other than that, just to pick up the high quality internal audit findings on the emergency preparedness, resilience and response processes. This is effectively the trust's preparation for emergencies, and we've got a very significant finding there, which is very good, and I think mirrors something we discussed at a previous Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. I think there was the one in December. We did, as flagged at I think the January board meeting, we did looked at the interaction between the BAF, which is a top-down analysis of the risk, with the operational risk registers, which are more bottom-up. And we wanted to ensure that the committee were cited on the bottom-up, the top risks of the bottom-up approach, if that makes sense. That is, the risks brought to the attention of senior management by the different business lines, as opposed to the strategic risks looked at from the top. And we were very happy with the approach there. We did have early discussions for the statutory audit work, which is due to start in the next 2 or 3 months, I believe. The idea being to complete and submit the audited annual report and accounts by the end of June. And I think that probably covers it.
Thank you, Damien. Comments or questions for Damien on that one?
One other point, I think I should mention that we had a separate meeting, which was an informal meeting of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee to brainstorm on the audit and risk plan for 25-26. The idea was effectively to have in the room a couple of members of the executive team, the governance team, ARAC members, and KPMG, our internal auditors. And the idea was for the NED to basically contribute a long list of ideas for the internal audit plan for next year. I thought it was a useful exercise. So we basically left Azra and others with a long list of ideas. And now she can do the hard work, which is to put that into some sort of structured plan, looks at what makes sense or not, and then look at priorities for next year's plan. But effectively, there was an early input of the ARAC committee into that, which I thought was good.
Azra?
So just to say, I've had a conversation with internal audit, picking up also a conversation I'd had with Suzanne in regards to certain areas to look at, and that long list will be going to the formal executive before it goes to the next ARAC committee to basically sign off what we think looks like a reasonable plan, clearly for audit committee sign off.
I think it's excellent to have that early input in, though, because too often the audit committees end up rubber stamping something that's been, agreed outside the audit committee often. So I think that's excellent. Thank you. Okay, and then last on this page, the Partnership Committee. I just want to take the opportunity to thank Joe for being involved in the setting up of the Partnership Committee with the ICS.
Oh, that's the integrated performance committee. That's not this one.
That's this different one. I still always get that name confused with that one.
So this is effectively the SLP.
Yeah.
So the only thing I was going to highlight on this was at the committees in common, we're having a series of strategic reviews from each of the provider collaboratives. So we saw the perinatal strategic review this time. And I think it was probably the most comprehensive that we've had, really well presented. There's lots more to do, but it was really good to see lots of data, lots of measures being used, quite a lot of stuff about inequalities as well, which we know anything around maternity, that's quite an issue. Iffy, you are the SRO on this, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Down to you. But it was very, very interesting as well. And, it's just the sort of service that I think works well as an SLP service because it's relatively small and we've come together. But it was very impressive. That's all I was going to highlight.
Thank you. I thought it was good. Any questions around that? No, thank you. I will report on the Council of Governors meeting. Again, it's as we could take it as read. It might just be worth pointing out that one of the things that I'm now doing with the Council of Governors, and I'll be doing this time next week at the next Council of Governors meeting, but last time I did virtually online is that a week after this meeting, I report back. I give a quick summary and answer questions from the governors about this meeting. So it's a way of keeping governors informed in addition to the other approaches that we have. I don't think there's anything I need to bring anyone's particular attention to on this. Any questions? No, thank you very much. So a review of this meeting, do we think that we met our aims? And perhaps given the theme that we've picked up through this meeting around the values of the organisation, do we feel that we've used the values of the organisation appropriately in the course of this meeting? Do you think there are things that we should have concentrated more on or reflect on as a result of this meeting? Suzanne.
I don't mean to be ambushing you with this suggestion, so apologies, I didn't talk to you about it before. I wonder whether other members of the board would find it helpful to have a written report from the chair that we read along with the other items on the agenda.
I'd be happy to do it. It's just whether it would be useful or not. I mean, there is, to some extent, there's often overlap. In fact, we were talking about it in relationship with the Council of Governors. There's overlap between my report and IFI's report in as much as there are areas that we cover, and we did what, you know, we were, when we were talking, I don't think we came to a decision. We were almost wondering for the Council of Governors whether we almost put in a joint report and just spoke to different aspects of it. Ife, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, something we've touched on before. I quite like the fluidity of the chair's feedback. You know, the trouble with writing a report is that firstly, you've got to write it it's got to be in the bundle, a good week and a bit. You know, although you could argue and say, well, that's not to say that you cannot talk about new stuff that has come in. And I think that there's likely to be some degree of overlap, you know. But I suppose it's a question for the wider board, you know, in terms of what people would value.
I'd be very open to it. Well, yes. I haven't had time to think about it, to have a mind on it myself to steer anybody. Manisa, sorry.
I haven't thought about it at all. I guess, Suzanne, I'm curious to understand what prompted the suggestion. If there's something that you think we would, sort of additional or sort of, something that would enhance the discussion, because that would help me kind of understand what we might benefit.
If I can comment on that, I mean, I think when Andrew and I have met informally, I've been really struck by the amount of work that he does, talking to other organisations and to partners, and advancing the interests of our patients as well as our organisation. And I find it quite hard to just hear something and take it on board and then think, is there anything I want to ask a question about there? So the suggestion was prompted from my awareness of how much Andrew does, how important it is to our partnership working in particular, the intelligence that he picks up through the kind of various chairs networks and meetings that he attends. And I think it's helpful, it would be helpful for us to have those insights.
That's very helpful. So thank you, Manise, for asking the question. So maybe what would be helpful is that, if his report tends to carries a lot of the external factors that are going on, and I don't see any point really in reproducing that one. I might touch on it, but because I touch on it anyhow, but I don't see any point in reproducing that one. But maybe more of a list of some of the engagements I've had or people I've talked to. As a framework then for discussion, that might be quite helpful then to have that. If that, I'm more than happy to do that. Rachel.
I think something thematic would be great. The kind of themes that have come through from some of the conversations you've had, I would personally find really useful. I had some other thoughts. One was that I've been reflecting that I know that people are having really good discussions in committees about the strategy, but I'm feeling as though we're missing them here. Maybe it's just me, but I wonder if we could perhaps revert to having a focus on different strategic elements on a rolling basis here, not to duplicate the discussions that are happening within the committees, but just to add to them and give us all a bit of oversight of those areas. So that's something I'd like to explore with people. And then just thinking about the values, and I've mentioned it to a couple of people, and I think we have a plan, but I always feel particularly uncomfortable when we have a service user kind of hanging off to one side. I feel as though people should be sitting at the table and part of the discussion, because otherwise it just doesn't feel as inclusive as it could be. So I think for the future, if we could have a little thing that says the presenter, and we properly welcome people to be part of our discussion, to me that would be more in line with our values.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Any other thoughts? Joe?
I agree with Rachel on that, but I guess my reflection is how well that involvement slot on the agenda is going for the board. You know, we've been doing it, I guess, a couple of years now. I'm trying to think. And I think the discussion today on the back of that, it felt very integrated in what we're doing. So it's, you know, it's bringing different aspects in, but, you know, we then morphed into other things that we're trying to focus on. And I thought that felt really natural, and I think it shows that we've come quite a way on this kind of stuff. So, you know, well done to you and Jacqueline and everyone involved in that. I think it works really well.
Good. Excellent. If there are no other comments, I think those are useful comments. We'll think about how we bring those in to the next meeting. Forward agenda, I think, is ready to note. Anyone got any other business that they would like to raise? I don't think we've had any questions.
It's just an invitation really to whether or not this is something we want to think about. I was quite struck looking at the document that came out in 2024 on sort of aspirations for the culture of care in inpatients, and they came to a view that it was better to refer to what we call service users as patients, and that was strongly supported by the community that they were working with. And I wonder whether we might want to reflect on that. And I think we probably already have had a discussion about it at various points as a board, but it was interesting to me that it was there in what was a very aspirational set of expectations from the NHS.
Thank you. Perhaps people who've been involved in that could think around that one and come back, because it's a sort of, my expectation is different trusts have very different feelings around it, and my previous trust did not use the word patient at all. Indeed, you're slightly drummed out of whatever you were drummed out of when it happened. But Sophie?
Yeah, this has been discussed extensively in the voluntary and community sector for a very long time now, and service user is considered a derogatory term. So it's really interesting, though. You have to go with the weight of what is being used, and when you try and change the tide, it happens very, very slowly, and it has to come from the people involved. So it has to be a bottom-up approach. But I'd be very interested to hear other views. I'd be very, very interested to hear how we get the views of our patients.
Ian?
Yeah, I mean, service user has a mental health context, doesn't it? I mean, I remember working in the early 90s and it coming in as a concept, and the idea of patient going out the window. There was an interim stage of clients, which was more of a local authority issue, which didn't resonate very well. I mean, it is the point, you have to ask people what they would like to be referred to. I think increasingly we're a diverse organisation, and my own keeps cutting out. My own view is that it's, you know, patient is probably a more universal concept, but yeah, you have to test it out and maybe use our involved structures to kind of think about it.
I think it is an ongoing discussion within our involved structure. I mean, Neil may have more detail, but certainly from the communications point of view, we've often had conversations about in our comms, what should we be using? And in fact, we use interchangeable because from my experience talking to people, you might have 5 people and 5 different views. So it's very hard to come up with one consensus that would satisfy everybody. But I'm sure we could talk to Jacqueline and see if there's a, you know, whether there's more of a consensus now.
Thank you. That would be helpful. And so let's do that. I tend to, when I go into a service, I tend to sort of try and gauge the temperature and see which word to use. And I end up using a slightly different word sometimes in different services because that's what seems appropriate. But then I'm muddling through with what I think's best, not necessarily with what is best. So I think that's important. Okay, if there's any other business, Let's call it 1:15. Moniz, sorry, the screen is a long way away from me. My last
Just slightly administrative. Suzanne, I didn't know the report that you were referring to, or I didn't recognize the name of the findings. If you wouldn't mind sharing, that would be of interest to me.
Thank you. Okay, it's 1:15 as near as damn it now. I suggest we meet at 1:45 for the part 2 meeting. And in the meantime, I think there are sandwiches and things behind me for those who wish them.